In this video, you will be learning how to make sour cherry varenyky, a traditional Ukrainian dish. So, if you've ever had pierogies before, you're basically going to make the dough, but instead of filling it with potatoes, you're going to fill it with sour cherries and sugar. This dish does take a few hours, but it is so worth it at the end. They are absolutely delicious. Here is the complete list of materials needed for this recipe. Note that if you do not have or cannot get sour cherries, you may substitute with blueberries, but you're going to need 3 to 4 sheets of paper towels to dry them, instead of draining with a medium-sized mixing bowl and sieve. Here are the ingredients you will need. This recipe will yield about 30 to 35 varenyky. Pause the video and make sure that you have all of your materials and ingredients ready before moving on to the next part. Let's get started with the recipe. These are the sour cherries I used. You can find them in any Eastern European market, but if you do not have access to one, then again, you can use blueberries. They're just as delicious. Place your sieve inside the medium-sized bowl. This is where you will be draining your cherries. You're going to need about 2 cups for this recipe. Next, I take my sieve and I shake up the cherries to make sure that they're evenly distributed. Then, you can take this whole apparatus and set it aside for now. Place your large mixing bowl in front of you and add 2 cups of flour. Then, add 1 teaspoon of salt. Mix the dry ingredients together with your wooden spoon or tablespoon. Set aside for now and have your cutting board in front of you. Measure out half a cup of water and pour it into your drinking glass or mug. Then, take your large egg, crack it, and put the yolk and the whites in the glass. Take a fork and whisk the egg and the water together. Make sure to get rid of any yolk clumps. Once you're done, set aside the egg mixture and grab your large mixing bowl with the flour in it. Make a hole in the center of the flour with your wooden spoon. Pour about 1/3 of the egg and water mixture into the hole. Mix the egg mixture into the surrounding flour using your wooden spoon. Repeat the last 2 steps until you have added all of your egg mixture into the flour and mixed thoroughly. Add half a cup of water to the mixture in 1/4 cup increments, and mix with your wooden spoon. Now the mixture should look like dough at this point, soft but workable, and slightly moist to the touch. Your hands will get messy for this next part. Scrape off all of the dough on the wooden spoon into the bowl and add it to the mixture. Once you're done, set the bowl aside and grab your large cutting board. Lightly dust half of a tablespoon of flour onto the cutting board. Gather your clump of dough in the bowl and place it on the cutting board. Begin kneading the clump of dough with both of your hands. That is to say, press into the dough firmly with your palms, make a clump, and repeat, mixing everything well. You will be kneading for a total of 5 to 7 minutes with a few steps in between. After about a minute, pick up the clump of dough with one of your hands and use the other hand to get another half tablespoon of flour, gently dust it onto the cutting board. Place the dough back down onto the cutting board and continue kneading, making sure to get all of the flour on the cutting board gathered up into the dough. Repeat this step 2 more times to add a total of 2 tablespoons of flour to the dough. Again, only knead for 5 to 7 minutes, or else you will overwork the dough and make it tough. This is what the dough should look like once you have finished. It should be a bit harder than before, but soft enough to be easily shaped and manipulated. If you press your fingers into the dough, it should leave imprints. Grab the clump of dough with your hands and split it in half, twisting to pull the two halves apart. Place one half of the dough on the cutting board and the other half into the large mixing bowl you've set aside. Let the dough sit out at room temperature for 15 minutes. During this time, fill up a large pot with 12 cups of water and turn the stove onto high heat for it to boil. Check the water periodically, and if it starts to boil, turn the heat down to low. Return to your table, grab your rolling pin, and roll out the dough until it is flat and about 1/16 of an inch thick. Grab your shot glass, turn it upside down, and press the edges into the dough, twisting until you cut out a dough circle. If your dough is still too thick, then either use your hands or the rolling pin to flatten it out more. You don't want it to be too thin, or else your sour cherry syrup will leak out of the dough. So try to get it somewhere around 1/16 of an inch. With your hand palm up holding the dough circle, use your teaspoon to scoop out 2 or 3 sour cherries from the top of the pile in the sieve into the center of the dough circle. You can also use 2 or 3 blueberries if you don't have cherries. Add about 1/4 of a teaspoon of sugar onto the cherries. Carefully holding your dough circle with the cherries and sugar in your hands, you want to take 2 opposite edges of the dough and bring them together, pinching the edges until you have formed a half moon shape. Pinch the edges again, starting at one corner of your half moon and going to the other corner, making sure that the dough is completely sealed. Continue pinching a few more times if necessary. You want to make sure that there are no holes in the dough, otherwise the cherry syrup will leak out during the boiling process. This is what your varenyk should look like, similar to one of Mrs. T's pierogies, but smaller. Set it aside onto your kitchen towel, making sure that you have the towel spread out on the table. Repeat this whole process, starting with cutting out a dough circle to shaping your final varenyk, until you run out of dough to cut circles with. Once you start getting into the middle of your sour cherry pile, be careful to not scoop out any syrup, or else it can make your varenyky leak. Sometimes, if my hands get a little too sticky, I like to take a little bit of flour, sprinkle it onto the cutting board, and gently dip my fingertips into it before shaping the varenyk. Okay, so here I'm going to slow down a little bit and show you what to do if syrup starts leaking out of your dough circle before you fully shaped it. So as you can see here, I accidentally scooped out some of the cherry syrup along with the cherries and placed it into my dough circle. To try and save it, pour out about a teaspoon of flour onto the cutting board and dip your fingertips into the flour before shaping your dough. Make sure that you are specifically covering that syrup with the flour, making sure to dry it out. Adding a lot of flour to the top of the dough like this can make it tough, so it's best to be cautious to not scoop out any syrup beforehand. But if it's too late and you want to try to save your varenyk, then you can use flour. If you notice that the varenyky on the kitchen towel are starting to leak, stop what you're doing. Try to seal up the leaks with flour and boil the ones that you already have shaped. You can come back to shape the rest of the varenyky later. When you are left with the scraps of the dough, gather them all up into a clump, take a pinch of flour, gently dust the cutting board with the flour and spread it out, and then roll out the new dough clump with a rolling pin. Keep cutting out dough circles and shaping varenyky until you have very little to no dough left. If you do have a tiny bit left over, add it to the other dough that we set aside in the large mixing bowl earlier. At this point, you should have shaped about 16 varenyky by now, and this is what they should look like. When the water is boiling, carefully and without touching the water, place one varenyk in at a time, holding one corner while you drop the opposite one in and retract your hand quickly. Add in the rest of the varenyky, stirring occasionally with your pasta fork around 5 to 10 minutes or until cooked. How do you know if they're cooked? Well, if one of the varenyky starts to float, either face up or corner up, that's when it's ready. Grab the varenyk with your pasta fork, gently shake to get the water out, and then transfer it to a heat-safe dish. Do not touch that dish after you start using it, as it will be hot, and keep it far away from your flame. Keep scooping out the varenyky one at a time and transferring them to your heat-safe dish until all of them have cooked. When all of them have cooked, set the spoon aside far away from the flame and keep the heat on low. Return to your other half of the dough to shape the rest of the varenyky and finish cooking them. If you are hungry and would like a small break from your labor and the varenyky have cooled down after 10 minutes, feel free to taste test one of them. They are absolutely delicious and hit the spot if you're craving something sweet. Once you're done with your second batch, congratulations! You just made authentic Ukrainian sour cherry varenyky.
Ой, чули, 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 ой, чули, чули ви, і здибав він дівчину, що несла пироги.